The proposed Kitimat liquid natural gas terminal project is located within the traditional territory of the Haida First Nations peoples and within the district of Kitimat. The purpose of the project was to receive and store LNG unloaded from tankers, regasify the LNG into natural gas, and import it into Kitimat in order to meet growing demands in the face of projected domestic gas shortages. As the project developed, however, North American production levels of LNG greatly increased. This caused the proponent to apply for an amendment to the EA certificate 3 years after it was issued, which would allow for the facility to be used for natural gas export. Stakeholders for this project include the Haida First Nations, Kitimat LNG, citizens of the Kitimat area, the Canadian federal government, and the British Columbia provincial government. A provincial EA certificate was required because the proposed facility exceeded thresholds put forward by the Environmental Assessment Office's review project regulations. Specifically, the facility exceeded thresholds in its capability to store energy and its capacity to process natural gas. A federal environmental assessment was also triggered based on the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act. Since assessments were required at both levels of government, a harmonized provincial-federal process was undertaken. The report was developed to fulfill both provincial and federal assessment requirements. On September 14, 2004, the Environmental Assessment Office issued an order stating that an environmental assessment certificate was required for the process. On December 19, 2006, the proponent requested that the Environmental Assessment Office provide an evaluation of an alternate site for the LNG terminal on an Indian reserve at Bish Cove. On June 1, 2006, an EA certificate was issued to the proponent authorizing the construction, operation, and decommissioning of a liquefied natural gas import terminal at Bish Cove. On January 9, 2009, amendments to the EA certificate were approved, expanding the scope of the project in order to allow for either import or export of LNG. Initially, the proponent selected Emsley Cove as the most suitable location for the terminal. But following an agreement made with the Haida peoples in 2005, the proponent decided that Bish Cove was a preferred location. In the 2006 EA document, no mention is made of differences in the scope of assessing results from the choice of Bish Cove as the proponent site. In the 2009 decision notice, however, it is stated that because the LNG storage and gas processing facilities would be located on the Haida Nation's reserve lands, these components were not subject to the certificate, and therefore not assessed. This points to a lack of transparency on the part of the EAO in disclosing how the site choice impacted the overall assessment. The choice of Bish Cove as a superior site does not seem to have been made with the goal of minimizing impacts. This location would result in a greater habitat loss, the clearing of more rare plant communities, and the loss of larger areas of wildlife habitat. Physical impacts were also more severe in this area, with more creek beds being more severely damaged during construction. In addition, Bish Cove was one of Haida's most valuable hunting and fishing grounds, and it was noted that they preferred this location to Emsley Cove. Some of the atmospheric environmental valued components that are highlighted are the emissions of greenhouse gases and air contaminants that may affect human health, wildlife, and vegetation. However, we found that no justification for the spatial boundary used for the assessment of atmospheric effects was obvious in the report. Some of the terrestrial environmental effects in the report were listed as stability of slopes, soil erosion, and sedimentation, as well as the loss of plant and plant communities and the potential for the introduction of invasive species in the area. The proponent commits to completing a rare plant survey after the EA process is complete. However, our group feels that this sort of survey should have been done prior to the assessment in order to inform the identification of impacts on these species. Loss of wildlife habitat and habitat avoidance, as well as alterations to move to corridors used by wildlife, and possible collisions with wildlife by vehicles used associated with the project were also listed in the assessment. As well, alterations or loss of riparian habitat that is important for fish productivity were also listed. Some of the impacts on marine environment and marine mammals include the direct mortality of organisms living in the intertidal and subtidal zones, potential for vessels and marine mammal collisions, potential for the introduction of invasive species, habitat avoidance of marine species due to activities associated with the project, changes to habitat resulting from sedimentation, and habitat loss due to destructive project activities during the construction phase. Some of the cultural impacts include the potential for disturbance of heritage or archaeological resources, including erosion and disturbances of sites of significance. The Heritage Impact Assessment was undertaken based on the assumption that the LNG facility would be located at Emsley Cove. However, an archaeological impact assessment of very limited scope was later completed for Bish Cove. Considering the preferred location is now Bish Cove, a full and detailed heritage and archaeological assessment is now required for the site. The proponent fails to identify culturally significant sites located on shoreline areas, and the potential for these sites to be impacted by erosion. In addition, the report outlines how increased pressure on local transportation systems to bring workers and materials to the site can be an impact. In addition, an increased demand for municipal services, including waste disposal, water supply, and sewage, were also listed. We found that no clear plan was outlined to deal with increased demand for waste removal and sewage treatment services. We also found that an incomplete description of quantity, treatment, and disposal of waste were in the report, and that no estimates were given for residual waste. In addition, the report highlighted how more vessels in the Kitimat area of the Douglas Channel will correspondingly increase the chance of vessel collision. As well, navigation by small recreational watercrafts may be negatively impacted. The report also highlighted how altered land and resource use in the project area could cause a restriction of access. In addition, this altered land use could cause changes to recreational activities, including hunting and fishing, as a loss of the appearance of the area may occur. The report states that cumulative effects of all the present and future land uses have been considered, but it didn't provide references for where this information was obtained. This report contains almost no description of the methodology used by the proponent when collecting the data that informed the report, including timing and frequency of surveys, and instead refers to a number of appendices that contain this information. It would be helpful for the reader if a concise summary of this information was contained in the body of the report. There is also no mention of uncertainties regarding the baseline conditions and effectiveness of mitigation techniques. Overall, the document does a good job of detailing public participation opportunities, and the proponent addresses public concerns by either justifying the choices made or altering the project. It also includes an assessment of alternatives, including the do-nothing option. Under CEAA, an assessment of this project was triggered by the requirement for multiple federal permits. Under CEAA 2012, the need for federal permits would not have been adequate to guarantee that an assessment would be carried out. Instead, the project would have only potentially been subject to an EA, as its potential processing capacity would cause it to be designated under the Regulations Designing Physical Activities section. Once this designation had been established, CEAA would then determine if a federal environmental assessment would have been required.